The Landlady. Billy Weaver had travelled down from London on the slow afternoon train, with a change at Swindon on the way, and by the time he got to Bath it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and the moon was coming up out of a clear, starry sky over the houses opposite the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. "Excuse me," he said, "but is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far away from here?" "Try the Bell and Dragon," the porter answered, pointing down the road. "They might take you in. It's about 1/4 of a mile along on the other side." Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the 1/4 mile to the Bell and Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there. But Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid city. "Find your own lodgings," he had said, "and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you've got yourself settled." Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was the one common characteristic of all successful businessmen. The big shots up at head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops in this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars, and 4 or 5 steps going up to their front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork on their doors and windows, and that the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said, "Bed and Breakfast." There was a vase of pussy willows, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved a bit closer. Green curtains, some sort of velvety material, were hanging down on either side of the window. The pussy willows looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano and a big sofa and several plump armchairs. And in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself, and all in all, it looked to him as though it would be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding-house. There would be beer and darts in the evenings, and lots of people to talk to, and it would probably be a good bit cheaper, too. He had stayed a couple of nights in a pub once before, and he had liked it. He had never stayed in any boarding-houses, and to be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and a powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this in the cold for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go. And now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window when all at once his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. Bed and breakfast, it said. Bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast. Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and not to walk away from that house, and the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led up to it, and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room he heard it ringing, and then, at once, It must have been at once, because he hadn't even had time to take his finger from the bell button. The door swung open, and a woman was standing there. Normally you ring the bell and you have at least a half-minute's wait before the door opens, but this dame was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell, and out she popped. It made him jump. She was about 45 or 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, she gave him a warm, welcoming smile. "Please, come in," she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward into the house. The compulsion, or more accurately, the desire to follow after her into that house, was extraordinarily strong. "I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back. "Yes, I know. I was wondering about a room." "It's all ready for you, my dear," she said. She had a round pink face and very gentle blue eyes. "I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her, "but the notice in your window just happened to catch my eye." "My dear boy," she said, "why don't you come in out of the cold? How much do you charge?" 5 and 6 a night, including breakfast." It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he had been willing to pay. "If that is too much," she added, "then perhaps I can reduce it just a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast? Eggs are expensive at the moment. It would be 6 less without the egg." 5 and 6 is fine," he answered. "I should like very much to stay here." "I knew you would. Do come in." She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one's best school friend welcoming one into the house to stay for the Christmas holidays. Billy took off his hat and stepped over the threshold. "Just hang it there," she said, "and let me help you with your coat." There were no other hats or coats in the hall. There were no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing. "We have it all to ourselves," she said, smiling at him over her shoulder as she led the way upstairs. "You see, it isn't very often I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest." The old girl is slightly dotty, Billy told himself, but at 5 and 6 a night, who gives a damn about that? "I should have thought you'd be simply swamped with applicants," he said politely. "Oh, I am, my dear, I am, of course I am. But the trouble is that I'm inclined to be just a teeny-weeny bit choosy and particular, if you see what I mean." Yes. But I am always ready. Everything is always ready, day and night in this house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And it is such a pleasure, my dear, such a very great pleasure when now and again I open the door and I see someone standing there who is just exactly right." She was halfway up the stairs, and she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling down at him with pale lips. "Like you," she added, and her blue eyes travelled slowly all the way down the length of Billy's body to his feet and then up again. On the first-floor landing she said to him, "This floor is mine." They climbed up a second flight. "And this one is all yours," she said. "Here's your room. I do hope you'll like it." She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in. "The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins. It is Mr. Perkins, isn't it?" "No," he said, "it's Weaver." "Mr. Weaver, how nice. I put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets, don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire at any time if you feel chilly." "Thank you," Billy said. "Thank you ever so much." He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed, and that the bedclothes had been neatly turned back on one side, all ready for someone to get in. "I'm so glad you appeared," she said, looking earnestly into his face. "I was beginning to get worried." "That's all right," Billy answered brightly. "You mustn't worry about me." He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it. "And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came here?" "I'm not a bit hungry, thank you," he said. "I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible, because tomorrow I've got to get up rather early and report to the office." "Very well, then. I'll leave you now so that you can unpack. But before you go to bed, Would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that, because it's the law of the land, and we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage in the proceedings, do we?" She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out of the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that his landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't worry Billy in the least. After all, she was not only harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war or something like that, and had never got over it. So a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little dachshund was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cosy. "I'm a lucky fellow," he thought, rubbing his hands. "This is a bit of all right." He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his on the page, and as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mal Holland from Cardiff. The other was Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. "That's funny," he thought suddenly. "Christopher Mal Holland. It rings a bell. Now, where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps, or a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't any of those." He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mal Holland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now he came to think of it, he wasn't at all sure that the second name didn't have almost as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. "Gregory Temple?" he said aloud, searching his memory. "Christopher Mal Holland? Such charming boys!" a voice behind him answered, and he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tea-tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her, and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. "They sound somehow familiar," he said. "They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before somewhere. Isn't that queer? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers or footballers or something like that?" "Famous?" she said, setting the tea-tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. "Oh, no, I don't think they were famous. But they were extraordinarily handsome, both of them, I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear, just exactly like you." Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. "Look here," he said, noticing the dates. "This last entry is over 2 years old." "It is?" "Yes, indeed. And Christopher Mal Holland's is nearly a year before that, more than 3 years ago." "Dear me," she said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh. I would never have thought it. How time does fly away from us all, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins?" "It's Weaver," Billy said. "Weaver. "Oh, of course it is," she cried, sitting down on the sofa. "How silly of me. I do apologize. In one ear and out the other, that's me, Mr. Weaver." "You know something," Billy said. "Something that's really quite extraordinary about all this." "No, dear, I don't." "Well, you see, both of these names, Mal Holland and Temple, I not only seem to remember each of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or other, in some peculiar way, they both appear to be sort of connected together as well, as though they were both famous for the same sort of thing, if you see what I mean, like Dempsey and Tunney, for example, or Churchill and Roosevelt." "How amusing," she said. "But come over here now, dear, and sit down beside me on the sofa, and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed." "You really shouldn't bother," Billy said. "I didn't mean you to do anything like that." He stood by the piano, watching her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed that she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. "I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers I saw them," Billy said. "I'll think of it in a second. I'm sure I will." There is nothing more tantalizing than a thing like this, which lingers just outside the borders of one's memory. He hated to give up. "Now, wait a minute," he said. "Wait just a minute. Mal Holland. Christopher Mal Holland. Wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour through the West Country, and then all of a sudden, 'Milk,' she said, 'and sugar?' Yes, please. And then all of a sudden, 'Eton schoolboy,' she said. Oh, no, my dear, that can't possibly be right, because my Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come over here now and sit next to me and warm yourself in front of this lovely fire. Come on, your tea is all ready for you." She patted the empty place beside her on the sofa, and she sat there smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him. "There we are," she said. "How nice and cosy this is, isn't it?" Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute or so, neither of them spoke. But Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not in the least unpleasant, and it reminded him, well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts? New leather? Or was it the corridors of a hospital? "Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea," she said at length. "Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea as dear, sweet Mr. Mulholland." "I suppose he left fairly recently," Billy said. He was still puzzling his head about the two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers, in the headlines. "Left?" she said, arching her brows. "But, my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is also here. They're on the 3rd floor, both of them together." Billy set down his cup slowly on the table and stared at his landlady. She smiled back at him, and then she put out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee. "How old are you, my dear?" she asked. 17. 17! She cried. "Oh, it's the perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was also 17, but I think he was a trifle shorter than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was. And his teeth weren't quite so white. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Did you know that?" "They're not as good as they look," Billy said. "They've got simply masses of fillings in them at the back." "Mr. Temple, of course, was a little older," she said, ignoring his remark. "He was actually 28, and yet I never would have guessed it if he hadn't told me, never in my whole life. There wasn't a blemish on his body." A what?" Billy said. "His skin was just like a baby's." There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea. Then he set it down again gently in its saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she seemed to have lapsed into another of her silences. He sat there staring straight ahead of him into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. "That parrot," he said at last. "You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first saw it through the window from the street. I could have sworn it was alive. Alas, no longer." "It's most terribly clever the way it's been done," he said. "It doesn't look in the least bit dead." "Who did it?" "I did." "You did?" "Of course," she said. "And have you met my little Basil as well?" She nodded towards the dachshund curled up so comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at it, and suddenly he realized that this animal had all the time been just as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it gently on the top of its back. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to one side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, greyish-black and dry, and perfectly preserved. "Good gracious me!" he said. "How absolutely fascinating!" He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. "It must be most awfully difficult to do a thing like that." "Not in the least," she said. "I starve all my little pets myself when they pass away. Will you have another cup of tea?" "No, thank you," Billy said. The tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it. "You did sign the book, didn't you? Oh, yes. That's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, then I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that almost every day with Mr. Mal Holland and Mr. Temple," Billy said. "Gregory Temple. Excuse me asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years?" Holding her teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked up at him out of the corners of her eyes and gave him another gentle little smile. "No, my dear," she said. "Only you." Dip in the Pool. On the morning of the 3rd day the sea calmed. Even the most delicate passengers, those who had not been seen around the ship since sailing time, emerged from their cabins and crept onto the sun-deck, where the deck steward gave them chairs and tucked rugs around their legs and left them lying in rows, their faces upturned to the pale, almost heatless January sun. It had been moderately rough the first 2 days, and this sudden calm and the sense of comfort that it brought created a more genial atmosphere over the whole ship. By the time evening came, the passengers, with 12 hours of good weather behind them, were beginning to feel confident, and at 8 o'clock that night the main dining-room was filled with people eating and drinking with the assured, complacent air of seasoned sailors. The meal was not half over when the passengers became aware, by the slight friction between their bodies and the seats of their chairs, that the big ship had actually started rolling again. It was very gentle at first, just a slow, lazy leaning to one side, then to the other, but it was enough to cause a subtle, immediate change of mood over the whole room. A few of the passengers glanced up from their food, hesitating, waiting, almost listening for the next roll, smiling nervously, little secret glimmers of apprehension in their eyes. Some were completely unruffled. Some were openly smug, a number of the smug ones making jokes about food and weather in order to torture the few who were beginning to suffer. The movement of the ship then became rapidly more and more violent, and only 5 or 6 minutes after the first roll had been noticed, she was swinging heavily from side to side, the passengers bracing themselves in their chairs, leaning against the pull as in a car cornering. At last the really bad roll came, and Mr. William Butterball, sitting at the purser's table, saw his plate of poached turbot with hollandaise sauce sliding suddenly away from under his fork. There was a flutter of excitement, everybody reaching for plates and wine-glasses. Mrs. Renshaw, seated at the purser's right, gave a little scream and clutched that gentleman's arm. "Going to be a dirty night," the purser said, looking at Mrs. Renshaw. "I think it's blowing up for a very dirty night." There was just the faintest suggestion of relish in the way the purser said this. A steward came hurrying up and sprinkled water on the tablecloth between the plates. The excitement subsided. Most of the passengers continued with their meal. A small number, including Mrs. Renshaw, got carefully to their feet and threaded their ways with a kind of concealed haste between the tables and through the doorway. "Well," the purser said, "there she goes." He glanced around with approval at the remainder of his flock, who were sitting quiet, looking complacent, their faces reflecting openly that extraordinary pride that travellers seem to take in being recognized as good sailors. When the eating was finished and the coffee had been served, Mr. Butterball, who had been unusually grave and thoughtful since the rolling started, suddenly stood up and carried his cup of coffee around to Mrs. Renshaw's vacant place next to the purser. He seated himself in the chair, then immediately leaned over and began to whisper urgently in the purser's ear. "Excuse me," he said, "but could you tell me something, please?" The purser, small and fat and red, bent forward to listen. "What's the trouble, Mr. Butterball?" "What I want to know is this." The man's face was anxious, and the purser was watching it. "What I want to know is, will the captain already have made his estimate on the day's run? You know, for the auction pool? I mean, before it began to get rough like this." The purser, who had prepared himself to receive a personal confidence, smiled and leaned back in his seat to relax his full belly. "I should say so, yes," he answered. He didn't bother to whisper his reply, although automatically he lowered his voice, as one does when answering a whisperer. "About how long ago do you think he did it?" "Sometime this afternoon. He usually does it in the afternoon." "About what time?" "Oh, I don't know. Around 4 o'clock, I should guess." "Now, tell me another thing. How does the captain decide which number it shall be? Does he take a lot of trouble over that?" The purser looked at the anxious, frowning face of Mr. Butterball, and he smiled, knowing quite well what the man was driving at. "Well, you see, the captain has a little conference with the navigating officer, and they study the weather and a lot of other things, and then they make their estimate." Mr. Butterball nodded, pondering this answer for a moment. Then he said, "Do you think the captain knew there was bad weather coming today?" "I couldn't tell you," the purser replied. He was looking into the small black eyes of the other man, seeing the two single little specks of excitement dancing in their centres. "I really couldn't tell you, Mr. Butterball. I wouldn't know." "If this gets any worse, it might be worth buying some of the low numbers. What do you think?" The whispering was more urgent, more anxious now. "Perhaps it will," the purser said. "I doubt whether the old man allowed for a really rough night. It was pretty calm this afternoon when he made his estimate." The others at the table had become silent and were trying to hear, watching the purser with that intent, half-cocked, listening look that you can see also at the racetrack when they are trying to overhear a trainer talking about his chance. The slightly open lips, the upstretched eyebrows, the head forward and cocked a little to one side, that desperately straining, half-hypnotized listening look that comes to all of them when they are hearing something straight from the horse's mouth. "Now, suppose you were allowed to buy a number. Which one would you choose today?" Mr. Butterball whispered. "I don't know what the range is yet," the purser patiently answered. "They don't announce the range till the auction starts after dinner, and I'm really not very good at it anyway. I'm only the purser, you know." At that point, Mr. Butterball stood up. "Excuse me all," he said, and he walked carefully away over the swaying floor between the other tables, and twice he had to catch hold of the back of a chair to steady himself against the ship's roll. "The sun deck, please," he said to the elevator man. The wind caught him full in the face as he stepped out onto the open deck. He staggered and grabbed hold of the rail and held on tight with both hands, and he stood there looking out over the darkening sea, where the great waves were welling up high, and white horses were riding against the wind with plumes of spray behind them as they went. "Pretty bad out there, wasn't it, sir?" the elevator man said on the way down. Mr. Butterball was combing his hair back into place with a small red comb. "Do you think we've slackened speed at all on account of the weather?" he asked. "Oh, my word, yes, sir. We slackened off considerable since this started. You've got to slacken off speed in weather like this, or you'll be throwing the passengers all over the ship." Down in the smoking room, people were already gathering for the auction. They were grouping themselves politely around the various tables, the men a little stiff in their dinner jackets, a little pink and overshaved and stiff beside their cool, white-armed women. Mr. Butterball took a chair close to the auctioneer's table. He crossed his legs, folded his arms, and settled himself in his seat with the rather desperate air of a man who has made a tremendous decision and refuses to be frightened. The pool, he was telling himself, would probably be around $7,000. That was almost exactly what it had been the last 2 days, with the numbers selling for between $300 and $400 apiece. Being a British ship, they did it in pounds, but he liked to do his thinking in his own currency. $7,000 was plenty of money. My goodness, yes. And what he would do, he would get them to pay him in $100 bills, and he would take it ashore in the inside pocket of his jacket. No problem there. And right away, yes, right away, he would buy a Lincoln Convertible. He would pick it up on the way from the ship and drive it home just for the pleasure of seeing Ethel's face when she came out the front door and looked at it. Wouldn't that be something, to see Ethel's face when he glided up to the door in a brand-new pale green Lincoln Convertible? "Hello, Ethel, honey," he would say, speaking very casual. "I just thought I'd get you a little present. I saw it in the window as I went by, so I thought of you, and how you were always wanting one. You like it, honey?" he would say. "You like the color?" And then he would watch her face. The auctioneer was standing up behind his table now. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted, "the captain has estimated the day's run ending midday tomorrow at 515 miles. As usual, we will take the 10 numbers on either side of it to make up the range. That makes it 505 to 525. And, of course, for those who think the true figure will be still farther away, there'll be Lowfield and Highfield sold separately as well. Now we'll draw the first numbers out of the hat. Here we are. 512. The room became quiet. The people sat still in their chairs, all eyes watching the auctioneer. There was a certain tension in the air, and as the bids got higher, the tension grew. This wasn't a game or a joke. You could be sure of that by the way one man would look across at another who had raised his bid, smiling perhaps, but only the lips smiling, the eyes bright and absolutely cold. Number 512 was knocked down for £110. The next 3 or 4 numbers fetched roughly the same amount. The ship was rolling heavily, and each time she went over, the wooden panelling on the walls creaked as if it were going to split. The passengers held onto the arms of their chairs, concentrating upon the auction. "Lowfield," the auctioneer called out. "The next number is Lowfield." Mr. Butterball sat up very straight and tense. He would wait, he had decided, until the others had finished bidding. Then he would jump in and make the last bid. He had figured that there must be at least $500 in his account at the bank at home, probably nearer 6. That was about £200, over 200. This ticket wouldn't fetch more than that. "As you all know," the auctioneer was saying, "Lowfield covers every number below the smallest number in the range, in this case, every number below 505. So if you think this ship is going to cover less than 505 miles in the 24 hours ending at noon tomorrow, you better get in and buy this number. So, what am I bid?" It went clear up to £130. Others beside Mr. Butterball seemed to have noticed that the weather was rough. 140. 50. There it stopped. The auctioneer raised his hammer. "Going at 150. 60, Mr. Butterball called. And every face in the room turned and looked at him. 70, 80, Mr. Butterball called. 90, 200, Mr. Butterball called. He wasn't stopping now, not for anyone. There was a pause. "Any advance on £200? "Sit still," he told himself. "Sit absolutely still and don't look up. It's unlucky to look up. Hold your breath. No one's going to bid you up so long as you hold your breath." "Going for £200. The auctioneer had a pink, bald head, and there were little beads of sweat sparkling on top of it. "Going." Mr. Butterball held his breath. "Going." "Gone." The man banged the hammer on the table. Mr. Butterball wrote out a cheque and handed it to the auctioneer's assistant. Then he settled back in his chair to wait for the finish. He did not want to go to bed before he knew how much there was in the pool. They added it up after the last number had been sold, and it came to £2,100 odd. That was around $6,000. 90% to go to the winner, 10% to Seamen's Charities. 90% of 6,000 was 5,400. Well, that was enough. He could buy the Lincoln Convertible, and there would be something left over too. With this gratifying thought, he went off, happy and excited, to his cabin. When Mr. Butterball awoke the next morning, he lay quite still for several minutes with his eyes shut, listening for the sound of the gale, waiting for the roll of the ship. There was no sound of any gale, and the ship was not rolling. He jumped up and peered out of the porthole. The sea, oh, Jesus God, was smooth as glass! The great ship was moving through it fast, obviously making up for time lost during the night. Mr. Butterball turned away and sat slowly down on the edge of his bunk. A fine electricity of fear was beginning to prickle under the skin of his stomach. He hadn't a hope now. One of the higher numbers was certain to win it after this. "Oh, my God," he said aloud. "What shall I do?" What, for example, would Ethel say? It was simply not possible to tell her he had spent almost all of their 2 years' savings on a ticket in the ship's pool. Nor was it possible to keep the matter secret. To do that, he would have to tell her to stop drawing checks. And what about the monthly installments on the television set and the Encyclopedia Britannica? Already he could see the anger and contempt in the woman's eyes. the blue becoming grey, and the eyes themselves narrowing as they always did when there was anger in them. "Oh, my God, what shall I do?" There was no point in pretending that he had the slightest chance now, not unless the goddamn ship started to go backwards. They would have to put her in reverse and go full speed astern and keep right on going if he was to have any chance of winning it now. Well, maybe he should ask the captain to do just that. Offer him 10% of the profits. Offer him more if he wanted it. Mr. Butterball started to giggle. Then very suddenly he stopped, his eyes and mouth both opening wide in a kind of shocked surprise. For it was at this moment that the idea came. It hit him hard and quick, and he jumped up from the bed, terribly excited, ran over to the porthole, and looked out again. Well, he thought, why not? Why ever not? The sea was calm, and he wouldn't have any trouble keeping afloat until they picked him up. He had a vague feeling that someone had done this thing before, but that didn't prevent him from doing it again. The ship would have to stop and lower a boat, and the boat would have to go back maybe half a mile to get him, and then it would have to return to the ship, the whole thing. An hour was about 30 miles. It would knock 30 miles off the day's run. That would do it. Lowfield would be sure to win it then. Just so long as he made certain someone saw him falling over. But that would be simple to arrange. And he'd better wear light clothes, something easy to swim in. Sports clothes, that was it. He would dress as though he were going up to play some deck tennis. Just a shirt and a pair of shorts and tennis shoes. And leave his watch behind. What was the time? 9:15. The sooner the better then. Do it now and get it over with. Have to do it soon, because the time limit was midday. Mr. Butterball was both frightened and excited when he stepped out onto the sundeck in his sports clothes. His small body was wide at the hips, tapering upward to extremely narrow, sloping shoulders, so that it resembled, in shape at any rate, a bollard. His white, skinny legs were covered with black hairs, and he came cautiously out on deck, treading softly in his tennis shoes. Nervously, he looked around him. There was only one other person in sight, an elderly woman with very thick ankles and immense buttocks, who was leaning over the rail, staring at the sea. She was wearing a coat of Persian lamb, and the collar was turned up, so Mr. Butterball couldn't see her face. He stood still, examining her carefully from a distance. Yes, he told himself, she would probably do. She would probably give the alarm just as quickly as anyone else. But wait 1 minute. Take your time, William Butterball. Take your time. Remember what you told yourself a few minutes ago in the cabin when you were changing? You remember that? The thought of leaping off a ship into the ocean 1,000 miles from the nearest land had made Mr. Butterball, a cautious man at the best of times, unusually advertent. He was by no means satisfied yet that this woman he saw before him was absolutely certain to give the alarm when he made his jump. In his opinion, there were two possible reasons why she might fail him. Firstly, she might be deaf and blind. It was not very probable, but on the other hand it might be so, and why take a chance? All he had to do was check it by talking to her for a moment beforehand. Secondly, and this will demonstrate how suspicious the mind of a man can become when it is working through self-preservation and fear. Secondly, it had occurred to him that the woman might herself be the owner of one of the high numbers in the pool, and as such would have a sound financial reason for not wishing to stop the ship. Mr. Butterball recalled that people had killed their fellows for far less than $6,000. It was happening every day in the newspapers, so why take a chance on that either? Check on it first. Be sure of your facts. Find out about it by a little polite conversation. Then, provided that the woman appeared also to be a pleasant, kindly human being, the thing was a cinch, and he could leap overboard with a light heart. Mr. Butterball advanced casually towards the woman and took up a position beside her, leaning on the rail. "Hello," he said pleasantly. She turned and smiled at him, a surprisingly lovely, almost a beautiful smile, although the face itself was very plain. "Hello," she answered him. Check, Mr. Butterball told himself, on the first question. She is neither blind nor deaf. "Tell me," he said, coming straight to the point, "what did you think of the auction last night?" "Auction?" she said, frowning. "Auction? What auction?" You know, that silly old thing they have in the lounge after dinner, selling numbers on the ship's daily run. I just wondered what you thought about it." She shook her head, and again she smiled, a sweet and pleasant smile that had in it perhaps the trace of an apology. "I'm very lazy," she said. "I always go to bed early. I have my dinner in bed. It's so restful to have dinner in bed." Mr. Butterball smiled back at her and began to edge away. "Gotta go and get my exercise now," he said. "Never miss my exercise in the morning. It was nice seeing you. Very nice seeing you." He retreated about 10 paces, and the woman let him go without looking around. Everything was now in order. The sea was calm. He was lightly dressed for swimming. There were almost certainly no man-eating sharks in this part of the Atlantic, and there was this pleasant, kindly old woman to give the alarm. It was a question now only of whether the ship would be delayed long enough to swing the balance in his favor. Almost certainly it would. In any event, he could do a little to help in that direction himself. He could make a few difficulties about getting hauled up into the lifeboat, swim around a bit, back away from them surreptitiously as they tried to come up close to fish him out. Every minute, every second gained would help him win. He began to move forward again to the rail, but now a new fear assailed him. Would he get caught in the propeller? He had heard about that happening to persons falling off the sides of big ships. But then he wasn't going to fall. He was going to jump, and that was a very different thing. Provided he jumped out far enough, he would be sure to clear the propeller. Mr. Butterball advanced slowly to a position at the rail about 20 yards away from the woman. She wasn't looking at him now. So much the better. He didn't want her watching him as he jumped off. So long as no one was watching, he would be able to say afterwards that he had slipped and fallen by accident. He peered over the side of the ship. It was a long, long drop. Come to think of it now, he might easily hurt himself badly if he hit the water flat. Wasn't there someone who once split his stomach open that way, doing a belly flop from the high dive? He must jump straight and land feet first, go in like a knife. Yes, sir! The water seemed cold and deep and grey, and it made him shiver to look at it. But it was now or never. Be a man, William Butterball, be a man. All right, then. Now, here goes. He climbed up onto the wide wooden top rail, stood there poised, balancing for 3 terrifying seconds. Then he leaped. He leaped up and out as far as he could go, and at the same time he shouted, "Help! Help! Help!" He shouted as he fell. Then he hit the water and went under. When the first shout for help sounded, the woman who was leaning on the rail started up and gave a little jump of surprise. She looked around quickly and saw, sailing past her through the air, this small man dressed in white shorts and tennis shoes, spread-eagled and shouting as he went. For a moment she looked as though she weren't quite sure what she ought to do. Throw a lifebelt, run away and give the alarm, or simply turn and yell. She drew back a pace from the rail and swung half around facing up to the bridge, and for this brief moment she remained motionless, tense, undecided. Then almost at once she seemed to relax, and she leaned forward far over the rail, staring at the water where it was turbulent in the ship's wake. Soon a tiny round black head appeared in the foam, an arm raised above it, once, twice, vigorously waving, and a small far-away voice was heard calling something that was difficult to understand. The woman leaned still farther over the rail, trying to keep the little bobbing black speck in sight. But soon, so very soon, it was such a long way away that she couldn't even be sure it was there at all. After a while another woman came out on deck. This one was bony and angular, and she wore horn-rimmed spectacles. She spotted the first woman and walked over to her, treading the deck in the deliberate military fashion of all spinsters. "So there you are," she said. The woman with the fat ankles turned and looked at her, but said nothing. "I've been searching for you," the bony one continued, "searching all over." "It's very odd," the woman with the fat ankles said. "A man dived overboard just now, with his clothes on." "Nonsense!" "Oh, yes. He said he wanted to get some exercise, and he dived in and didn't even bother to take his clothes off." "You better come down now," the bony woman said. Her mouth had suddenly become firm, her whole face sharp and alert, and she spoke less kindly than before. "And don't you ever go wandering about on deck alone like this again. You know quite well you're meant to wait for me." "Yes, Maggie," the woman with the fat ankles answered, and again she smiled, a tender, trusting smile, and she took the hand of the other one and allowed herself to be led away across the deck. "Such a nice man," she said. "He waved to me." The Wish. Under the palm of one hand, the child became aware of the scab of an old cut on his kneecap. He bent forward to examine it closely. A scab was always a fascinating thing. It presented a special challenge he was never able to resist. "Yes," he thought, "I will pick it off, even if it isn't ready, even if the middle of it sticks, even if it hurts like anything." With a fingernail, he began to explore cautiously around the edges of the scab. He got a nail underneath it, and when he raised it, but ever so slightly, it suddenly came off. The whole hard brown scab came off beautifully, leaving an interesting little circle of smooth red skin. Nice, very nice indeed. He rubbed the circle, and it didn't hurt. He picked up the scab, put it on his thigh, and flipped it with a finger so that it flew away and landed on the edge of the carpet, the enormous red and black and yellow carpet that stretched the whole length of the hall from the stairs on which he sat to the front door in the distance. A tremendous carpet, bigger than the tennis lawn, much bigger than that. He regarded it gravely, setting his eyes upon it with mild pleasure. He had never really noticed it before, but now, all of a sudden, the colours seemed to brighten mysteriously and spring out at him in a most dazzling way. "You see," he told himself, "I know how it is. The red parts of the carpet are red-hot lumps of coal. What I must do is this. I must walk all the way along it to the front door without touching them. If I touch the red, I will be burnt. As a matter of fact, I will be burnt up completely. And the black parts of the carpet, yes, the black parts are snakes, poisonous snakes, adders mostly, and cobras, thick like tree trunks round the middle. And if I touch one of them, I'll be bitten and I'll die before tea time. And if I get across safely, without being burnt and without being bitten, I will be given a puppy for my birthday tomorrow." He got to his feet and climbed higher up the stairs to obtain a better view of this vast tapestry of colour and death. Was it possible? Was there enough yellow? Yellow was the only colour he was allowed to walk on. Could it be done? This was not a journey to be undertaken lightly. The risks were far too great for that. The child's face, a fringe of white gold hair, 2 large blue eyes, a small pointed chin, peered down anxiously over the banisters. The yellow was a bit thin in places, and there were 1 or 2 whitish gaps, but it did seem to go all the way along to the other end. For someone who had only yesterday triumphantly travelled the whole length of the brick path from the stables to the summer-house without touching the cracks, this carpet thing should not be too difficult. Except for the snakes. The mere thought of snakes sent a fine electricity of fear running like pins down the backs of his legs and under the soles of his feet. He came slowly down the stairs and advanced to the edge of the carpet. He extended 1 small sandalled foot and placed it cautiously upon a patch of yellow. Then he brought the other foot up, and there was just enough room for him to stand with the 2 feet together. There! He had started. His bright oval face was curiously intent, a shade whiter perhaps than before, and he was holding his arms out sideways to assist his balance. He took another step, lifting his foot high over a patch of black, aiming carefully with his toe for a narrow channel of yellow on the other side. When he had completed the second step, he paused to rest, standing very stiff and still. The narrow channel of yellow ran forward unbroken for at least 5 yards, and he advanced gingerly along it, bit by bit, as though walking a tightrope. Where it finally curled off sideways, he had to take another long stride, this time over a vicious-looking mixture of black and red. Halfway across he began to wobble. He waved his arms around wildly, windmill fashion, to keep his balance, and he got across safely and rested again on the other side. He was quite breathless now, and so tense he stood high on his toes all the time, arms out sideways, fists clenched. He was on a big, safe island of yellow. There was lots of room on it. He couldn't possibly fall off, and he stood there, resting, hesitating, waiting, wishing he could stay forever on this big, safe yellow island. But the fear of not getting the puppy compelled him to go on. Step by step, he edged further ahead, and between each one he paused to decide exactly where he should put his foot. Once he had a choice of ways, either to left or right, and he chose the left because although it seemed the more difficult, there was not so much black in that direction. The black was what had made him nervous. He glanced quickly over his shoulder to see how far he had come. Nearly halfway. There could be no turning back now. He was in the middle, and he couldn't turn back, and he couldn't jump off sideways either, because it was too far. And when he looked at all the red and all the black that lay ahead of him, he felt that old sudden sickening surge of panic in his chest, like last Easter time, that afternoon when he got lost all alone in the darkest part of Piper's Wood. He took another step, placing his foot carefully upon the only little piece of yellow within reach, and this time the point of the foot came within a centimetre of some black. It wasn't touching the black. He could see it wasn't touching. He could see the small line of yellow separating the toe of his sandal from the black. But the snake stirred as though sensing his nearness, and raised its head and gazed at the foot with bright beady eyes, watching to see if it was going to touch. "I'm not touching you! You mustn't bite me! You know I'm not touching you!" Another snake slid up noiselessly beside the first, raised its head. Two heads now, two pairs of eyes staring at the foot, gazing at a little naked place just below the sandal strap where the skin showed through. The child went high up on his toes and stayed there, frozen stiff with terror. It was minutes before he dared to move again. The next step would have to be a really long one. There was this deep, curling river of black that ran clear across the width of the carpet, and he was forced by his position to cross it at its widest part. He thought first of trying to jump it, but decided he couldn't be sure of landing accurately on the narrow band of yellow on the other side. He took a deep breath, lifted one foot, and inch by inch he pushed it out in front of him, far, far out, then down and down, until at last the tip of his sandal was across and resting safely on the edge of the yellow. He leaned forward, transferring his weight to his front foot. Then he tried to bring the back foot up as well. He strained and pulled and jerked his body, but the legs were too wide apart and he couldn't make it. He tried to get back again. He couldn't do that either. He was doing the splits and he was properly stuck. He glanced down and saw this deep, curling river of black underneath him. Parts of it were stirring now and uncoiling and beginning to shine with a dreadfully oily glister. He wobbled, waved his arms frantically to keep his balance, but that seemed to make it worse. He was starting to go over. He was going over to the right. Quite slowly he was going over, then faster and faster, and at the last moment, instinctively, he put out a hand to break the fall, and the next thing he saw was this bare hand of his going right into the middle of a great, glistening mass of black, and he gave one piercing cry as it touched. Outside in the sunshine, far away behind the house, the mother was looking for her son. The Butler. As soon as George Cleaver had made his first million, he and Mrs. Cleaver moved out of their small suburban villa into an elegant London house. They acquired a French chef called Monsieur Estragon and an English butler called Tibbs, both wildly expensive. With the help of these two experts, the Cleavers set out to climb the social ladder and began to give dinner parties several times a week on a lavish scale. But these dinners never seemed quite to come off. There was no animation, no spark to set the conversation alight, no style at all. Yet the food was superb, and the service faultless. "What the heck's wrong with our parties, Tibbs?" Mr. Cleaver said to the butler. "Why don't nobody never loosen up and let themselves go?" Tibbs inclined his head to one side and looked at the ceiling. "I hope, sir, You will not be offended if I offer a small suggestion?
What is it?
It's the wine, sir.
What about the wine?
Well, sir, Monsieur Estragon serves superb food. Superb food should be accompanied by superb wine. But you serve them a cheap and very odious Spanish red.
Then why in heaven's name didn't you say so before, you twit? Cried Mr. Cleaver. I'm not short of money. I'll give them the best flipping wine in the world if that's what they want. What is the best wine in the world?
Claret, sir, the butler replied, from the greatest chateau in Bordeaux. Lafitte, Latour, Aubryon, Margaux, Mouton Rothschild, and Cheval Blanc, and from only the very greatest vintage years, which are, in my opinion, 1906, 1914, 1929, and 1945. Cheval Blanc was also magnificent in 1895 and 1921, and Aubryon in 1906.
Buy them all, said Mr. Cleaver. Fill the flipping cellar from top to bottom.
I can try, sir, the butler said, but wines like these are extremely rare and cost a fortune.
I don't give a hoot what they cost, said Mr. Cleaver. Just go out and get them.
That was easier said than done. Nowhere in England or in France could Tibbs find any wine from 1895, 1906, 1914, or 1921, but he did manage to get hold of some 29s and 45s. The bills for these wines were astronomical. They were, in fact, so huge that even Mr. Cleaver began to sit up and take notice, and his interest quickly turned into outright enthusiasm when the butler suggested to him that a knowledge of wine was a very considerable social asset. Mr. Cleaver bought books on the subject and read them from cover to cover. He also learned a great deal from Tibbs himself, who taught him, among other things, just how wine should be properly tasted. First, sir, you sniff it long and deep with your nose right inside the top of the glass, like this. Then you take a mouthful and you open your lips a tiny bit and suck in air, letting the air bubble through the wine. Watch me do it. Then you roll it vigorously around your mouth, and finally you swallow it. In due course, Mr. Cleaver came to regard himself as an expert on wine, and inevitably he turned into a colossal bore.
Ladies and gentlemen, he would announce at dinner, holding up his glass, this is a Margaux 29, the greatest year of the century. Fantastic bouquet, smells of cowslips. And notice especially the aftertaste, and how the tiny trace of tannin gives it that glorious astringent quality. Terrific, ain't it?
The guests would nod and sip and mumble a few praises, but that was all.
What's the matter with the silly twerps? Mr. Cleaver said to Tibbs after this had gone on for some time. Don't none of them appreciate a great wine?
The butler laid his head to one side and gazed upward. I think they would appreciate it, sir, he said, if they were able to taste it, but they can't.
What the heck do you mean they can't taste it?
I believe, sir, that you have instructed Monsieur Estragon to put liberal quantities of vinegar in the salad dressing.
What's wrong with that? I like vinegar.
Vinegar, the butler said, is the enemy of wine. It destroys the palate. The dressing should be made of pure olive oil and a little lemon juice. Nothing else.
Hogwash, said Mr. Cleaver.
As you wish, sir.
I'll say it again, Tibbs. You're talking hogwash. The vinegar don't spoil my palate one bit.
You're very fortunate, sir, the butler murmured, backing out of the room. That night at dinner, the host began to mock his butler in front of his guests.
Mr. Tibbs, he said, has been trying to tell me I can't taste my wine if I put vinegar in the salad dressing. Right, Tibbs?
Yes, sir, Tibbs replied gravely.
And I told him hogwash, didn't I, Tibbs?
Yes, sir.
This wine, Mr. Cleaver went on, raising his glass, tastes to me exactly like a Chateau Lafite 45. And what's more, it is a Chateau Lafite 45.
Tibbs, the butler, stood very still and erect near the sideboard, his face pale. If you'll forgive me, sir, he said, that is not a Lafite 45. Mr. Cleaver swung round in his chair and stared at the butler.
What the heck do you mean? He said. There's the empty bottles beside you to prove it.
These great clarets, being old and full of sediment, were always decanted by Tibbs before dinner. They were served in cut-glass decanters, while the empty bottles, as is the custom, were placed on the sideboard. Right now, 2 empty bottles of Lafite 45 were standing on the sideboard for all to see. "The wine you are drinking, sir," the butler said quietly, "happens to be that cheap and rather odious Spanish red." Mr. Cleaver looked at the wine in his glass, then at the butler. The blood was coming to his face now. His skin was turning scarlet. "You're lying, Tibbs," he said. "No, sir, I'm not lying," the butler said. "As a matter of fact, I have never served you any other wine but Spanish red since I've been here. It seemed to suit you very well." "I don't believe him," Mr. Cleaver cried out to his guests. "The man's gone mad." "Great wines," the butler said, "should be treated with reverence. It is bad enough to destroy the palate with 3 or 4 cocktails before dinner, as you people do, but when you slosh vinegar over your food into the bargain, then you might just as well be drinking dishwater." 10 outraged faces around the table stared at the butler. He had caught them off balance. They were speechless. "This," the butler said, reaching out and touching one of the empty bottles lovingly with his fingers, "this is the last of the 45s. The 29s have already been finished, but they were glorious wines. Monsieur Estragon and I enjoyed them immensely." The butler bowed and walked quite slowly from the room. He crossed the hall and went out of the front door of the house into the street, where Monsieur Estragon was already loading their suitcases into the boot of the small car, which they owned together.